Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel Consuming the Foreign in Medieval and Early Medieval Europe. Let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Michael Brauer. I'm Associate Professor of Medieval History and Head of Gastrosophie and Food Studies at the University of Salzburg. What we are going to see here tonight is a collaboration of colleagues, a loose network of people interested in food studies and food history. And now for the session tonight. You read the title already, but what does it mean? People who know the content will agree that most medieval and early modern recipe titles are descriptive, or as some people say, boring, but not all of them. Sometimes we find exotic titles such as titles referring to Muslim, pagan, or Turkish dishes, such as the Turkish rice, which Max Rumpold mentions. And sometimes they are even named after European countries or regions, such as Polish soups or Tyrolean noodles. But how do we interpret these findings as scholars? There are two possibilities, or two approaches: cultural transfer or image of the other. Answer one would be the recipes reflect cultural transfer. And what is cultural transfer? According to Peter Berg, it would mean that the objects in the original culture are first decontextualized and then afterwards recontextualized to enter their new culture. Accordingly, we would ask, do the recipes show signs of cultural transfer, for instance, from Arabic cuisine to Latin Europe, or in the case of Polish soups, from Poland to Austria? Answer number two would be the recipes construct an image of the other. An image of the other would be something like the notion of asymmetrical oppositions, according to German historian Reinhard Koselleck. He was talking about oppositions such as Hellenes and barbarians, which later transformed into Christians and pagans. The oppositions, for instance, the pagans, were either uncivilized and treacherous, or, and that's interesting, they could be or transform into a positive counterpart, the figure of the noble savage. Our question would be, what are the cultural connotations of religious and place names and of ingredients, respectively, in the specific setting where the recipe came into being? This transforms into the following presentations you've seen mentioned already. And I will briefly introduce our first speaker of tonight, Erzsebet Kovacs. Erzsebet Kovacs has been studying or obtaining degrees at ELTE University in Budapest and also at the Central European University. And as she coins herself, she is a classical philologist turned medievalist with a research interest in culinary and medical history. Let me mention the title of her MA thesis, which brought me in contact with her. It's called The Enjoyment of the Foreign, Muslim, and Italian Recipes of Medieval and Early Modern Europe. Erzsebet, the floor is yours.
So first of all, I would like to thank my MA thesis supervisor at CEU, Gerhard Jaritz, who kindly proposed me this topic. And secondly, I want to thank the organizers of this symposium for inviting me. Thank you so much. As you can see, I made a slight change in the title because this is more descriptive of the kinds of foods I want to talk about today. So when I made a survey of a couple of medieval cookbooks, it was instantly visible to me that some of the recipes have ethnonymic names referring to Saracens, Turks, or Heathens. So things like dishes like Saracen sauce, Turk's head, Heathen's cakes, and Heathen's peas. What are these dishes exactly? Why are these called Saracen? Where do we locate their Saracenness? Even as I was cooking today and making my own approximation of one of these dishes, the Brodium Saracenicum, Saracen broth, or Saracen soup or sauce, found in the Liber de Coquina cookbook, which comes from the 13th century Sicily, it occurred to me again that the recipe is basically a Platonic idea of a dish, meaning that with all its regional variations and its personal variations, how a dish turns out, what ingredients can be swapped for each other. At the end of the day, it is intended to remain the same dish. You know it when you see it. So what were those features which were thought by contemporaries that these are the features which make a dish Saracen? I was trying to find those features and think about their context, which is basically the picture found on my first slide. So this is a statue of Saint Maurice in Magdebur Cathedral, 13th century. And I'm including this statue because it represents a statue of great contradictions. On the one hand, it is visibly a Black person with Black features. On the other hand, it is a statue of Saint Maurice, a saint who comes from Egypt and is also a patron saint of the Roman emperors. So is this what being Saracen meant to those people? Being Black, visibly Black, with this color and the size of the lips you can see on the statue, but at the same time, it is connected with worldly and holy power and holiness. So, and also it raises the question, if being Saracenness is connected to what points of contact and which eras. For example, this statue is connected to Emperor Frederick II. So can we suppose that these ideas about Saracenness come from 13th century, and also Sicily, or we should suppose other areas, other points of contact, for example, Andalusia, or the Holy Land, or Egypt. So I would like to propose another source of context, and this is Shiverick Romance. So the father of Parsifal, Moretti, in this Shiverick Romance, visits Baldak, which is actually Baghdad, to visit its ruler, its Heathen ruler, who is actually a heathen counterpart of the Pope in Rome, as the text itself says. So just the same way as Christian men go to Rome, so there was the heathen custom to visit Rome. So there's power, the equivalent of Christian Pope's power. Now we have another romance from the same time, the Sultan of Babylon, which actually tells us how a sultan pillaged the city of Rome, and then at the feast they drank the blood of beasts and milk and ate honey, And then interestingly, snakes fried with oil. So is this what Saracens eat? Interesting. Now, my third example would be Richard Coeur de Lion. So this is a Shiverick Romance about the escapades of Richard the Lion-Hearted at the Holy Land, which adds insult to injury, so to speak, because in this poem, Richard falls ill, and then an old knight gives the advice that he should be fed, well, the ideal thing would be pork, but no pork is to be found at the Holy Land. So he should be fed a young and fat Saracen, which, or shall I say, his flesh is made with powder, spicery, colored with saffron. And then actually this cures the king, so much so that the next time he wants to eat the same dish again. And now the cook is found out because he has to present a head. And now it turns out that this was a Saracen head. And it is visible that Richard sees his black bird, his white teeth, how his lips grinned wide, so physical features again, and his swart face, so his swarthy face, his black face. But then he says that this is the ideal food for Englishmen, boiled, roasted, and baked, like medieval meat. So note the culinary techniques used for medieval meat. And not only Richard likes eating these Saracen heads, but with a cruel joke, he also presents these Saracen heads to his Saracen guests. So this is the description of how these were made. And this is what his Saracen guests thought about eating this food. So basically, it is a description of a piece of a dinner theater. So is this the context for Saracen food? Well, let's see the recipes themselves. So first of all, this is the recipe I cooked today, this Brodium Saracenicum. Now, this 13th century Sicilian cookbook, Liber dei Coquina, has actually two different recipes for this Saracen broth. One of them is made with capons, their livers, some bread, wine, and sucis agris, so sour juices, which might be orange juice or verjuice, or I think maybe even vinegar. So this capon meat is cooked in a sauce made with wine, these sour juices, and with added dates, raisins, almonds. And then the recipe adds colora sicut placet. Give it the color whichever you want. So this is the first. Now the second is in the chapter about fish. So the book describes a dish called scapetta piscium, which is made with fried fish, onions, raisins, saffron, wine vinegar, and so on and so forth. It's basically fried fish with some vinegar, made sour and sweet with the addition of vinegar and honey or sugar, as the end of the recipe makes it clear. Quodsi volueris ipsum acrum dulce facere. Now, interestingly enough, the recipe then adds, and this is the third part at the bottom of my screen, sicum eisdem addideris amygdalas mondatas. So if you add to them almonds, raisins, dates, and some such, along with the fried onions, this then will be called Saracen broth. And you can also add apples and pears. So it is interesting that we have two different recipes for the same dish. What gives? What is the explanation? Now, interestingly, this fish dish, so this capeta piscium, a variety of which may be called Saracen broth, this may actually correspond to some authentic Islamic dishes, such as the one in the Kant's, an Egyptian cookbook. And also there's an etymological connection in that sigbaj, which is basically a sour and sweet dish, corresponds to the name scapeta. So this might be a legitimate point of contact between the two cultures. This may be the dish which they borrowed and then modified so that it becomes Saracen broth. Now let's see French recipes for this Saracen sauce. Two varieties from the Viandier and one from the Ménagier. Now note that again the ingredients are quite different. The French recipes use eels, and then even though they use spices and wine also, they don't use any sweetener. So this characteristic sweet and sour taste is already lost. And what about eels? They are not really halal food, so they can't be Islamic. But at the same time, if we think of the Sultan of Babylon Shiverick Romance, where the Sultan is described as eating snakes fried in oil, I think it is legitimate to ask if these French dishes were intended to remind the eater of the image of the Sultan eating snakes, since eels and snakes are similar in shape. So this might be again a piece of dinner theater intended for the medieval consumer. Let's see some English recipes for the Saracen sauce. So first, so the interesting thing is that if we try to find their Saracenness, again, we tried totally different ingredients. The two recipes on the one side of my screen describe a white sauce. So it would seem that now a white colored sauce can be called Saracen, and it is made with cow's milk, which is a rare ingredient in medieval recipes, and then eggs, a lot of ginger, and they need to be white. Now compare it with the two recipes on the other side of my screen. The first one comes from the form of curry. Note that it has totally different ingredients because it uses rose hips and then almonds. Almonds and flour of rice flour are used to make a liquid, an almond milk. And this is then colored with rose hips and flourished with pomegranate seeds. Interestingly enough, this is not a flesh dish because the recipe adds that on flesh days, you can eat capons to it. So now an interesting ingredient again, rose hips, which seems like a characteristically English addition to make the sauce red. And we find this red color again in the second recipe, which comes from the Wagstaff Miscellany a century later, which in my opinion illustrates the evolution of this recipe in that it uses this sauce now as a cooking sauce for some fillets or pellets, so meatballs. Note that one sentence I colored red. A portion of Saunders is used to color it Saracen color, because as the recipe explains, the color needs to be of his own kind. So now Saracen color actually denotes this red color. So should we take it to mean that redness indicate Saraceness. But then how to explain these white recipes? So these were intended to illustrate the variety of these Saracen sauces. Let's see the second group of these recipes, the so-called Turk's heads. Now, Hyatt proposed that it was an Andalusian recipe coming from the Manuscrito Anonimo, which were the original of these English recipes for Turk's head. But if we compare the recipes, as you can see it on my screen, they describe totally different dishes. The first one, coming from the manuscript additional, Ted the Turk, is actually an early variety of haggis filled with pork. Now, a distinctly not halal type of foodstuff again. And then this haggis, this pork stomach filled with pork meat, this is then cooked and presented with endured on the table. The second one is seems to be a pie filled with coney rabbits and little birds, and then dates, honey, cheese. And then, interestingly enough, the recipe adds that after that, une couche de farce festicade is added. So a kind of like a marzipan is added. And the whole thing needs to be in the shape of a human face. Now, if we take a look at the Andalusian recipe, it basically describes a sort of cake, a sort of sponge cake baked in a shape which would represent or remind us of a human head. But these are three totally different dishes. We have also, I would like to show an example for a German Turk's head, which comes from the Das Buch von guter Speise. I'm including here this somewhat anachronistic picture because it's a picture by Archimboldo, but the effect of the finished dish would be something like that. So a combination of pies and baked meat to remind the eater of a human head. So basically we see that totally different kinds of dishes are called Turk's head just because the dish looks somewhat like a human head. But we shouldn't suppose, I think, that these dishes directly come from Islamic examples, as we have seen with the Manuscrito Anonimo recipe for a sponge cake. My third kind of dish would be the so-called Heathen cakes, which come from, the first recipe comes from the Das Buch von guter Speise, and a similar recipe comes from a Bavarian cookbook, the Intakochbuch. This would be my conclusion. So for some of these recipes, you can suppose Islamic origins, such as, for example, this Brodium Saracenicum coming from Scapetta Piscium, and this coming from Assig Badge. And then these Heathen cakes may be coming from Andalusian fritters. And the dish called Heathen peas originating maybe from Islamic almond pastes. But then we also see adaptations to Christian Western ingredients, tastes, ideas, and needs, such as the ingredients lard, wine, pork, or blood, which are not exactly halal, or eels and roast hips. But also the concept that a combination of almonds, honey, and spice can maybe denote this exotic Saraceness. And also I think some of the recipes are intended to present a piece of dinner theater. Some recipes for Saracen sauce. Turks had recipes, and then Heathen piece. But then there's also regional variety. Not all recipes are found in all cookbooks of all nations, such as, for example, this Heathen piece we find only in a German cookbook. So I think that this would be my main point, that Saracenness can be communicated in very different ways, depending on the Christian Western European nations themselves. So for the Englishman or the Frenchman, different things may mean Saracenness. And further questions, how to discover these actual points of contact, areas of contact, and modes and means of recipe transmission. So this would be things to research later. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Erzsebet, for your fascinating presentation. And I think everybody noted that these findings, which arose from the MA thesis, were an inspiration for the whole panel, because we found out that many people in Salzburg are also interested in these kinds of topics. I have to say, sorry to Julia Eibinger, I forgot to introduce our Q&A moderator. So, but Christoph did it in the chat, and I don't know.
I know it's. I don't think it's a problem. Most people already know me, and I just want to remind everyone again to write their questions down below in the Q&A. There's a button for that, and we can answer those as soon as they come up.
Thanks. And while people are typing and typing, Erzsebet, let me ask one. Oh no, Helmut Klug.
Yes, yes, thank you. Thank you for pointing out the recipe in the Buch von Gute Spise, which I've probably read several times, but didn't realize where it is going. So that's the remark. The question is, what about the connotation with Saracen or Muslim? I didn't hear you mention if this transports positive or negative feelings. Can you say something to that?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think so. This is what I wanted to illustrate with the first part of my presentation, giving some context. So to me now it seems like really two sides of the same coin. So one side would be these are heathen people, not Christians. This is what the Shiverick romances, some of the romances make clear. But at the same time, they somehow represent some really fascinating, exotic, rich quality to Christians, which is to be imitated. So it is really interesting, a mixture of admiration and, well, I won't say hate, but they do know that these are not Christian people. And I think that the recipes themselves are to be understood in this two-sided context.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, while the others are typing, let me ask you about the transformation of these recipes and your geographical space. It seemed to me that the further you're away from these real contact zones of Christian and Islamic areas, the more creative you could get with your Saracen associations, because maybe proper Islamic or let's say Arabic foods were not known in England. Is that possible, or don't you think there could be a connection?
Yes, that's a really good question, and I was wondering that myself. It would be really good to know if we could make clear those modes of transmission, because I think it might be probable that maybe through merchants they could get familiar with each other's dishes. So at this point, I think that Andalusia is our best bet. And then somehow those dishes get further and further, and they lose they lose almost every recognizability. But so at this point, it's not totally clear how it happened. Mm-hmm. So I would love to know more about it.
Great. Maybe we can save other questions for the final discussion or for the conclusion. Let's move on and go to Barbara Denicoló and her presentation. Barbara Denicoló is a colleague in medieval history from the University of Salzburg, and actually her office is not far away. She studied in Innsbruck and is now a research assistant here in Salzburg. Her PhD topic is dealing with cookbooks between the Middle Ages and modern times, digital edition and analysis. And maybe she's going to mention it. She's also contributing to the CoReMA project. But besides that, and I think people can be grateful for that, she's doing living history in museums and is also cooking with historic recipes. For instance, this week's Friday in the evening session, she's gonna present a dish. So, Barbara, please start your presentation.
Yeah, I hope you can see now my first slide. I'm looking for traces of local, regional and national cuisines in medieval and early modern recipes. And because I think foodstuffs and their preparation are always entangled in a complex web of transfers of knowledge, technologies, and practices, which connect people from different backgrounds and places and lead to various perceptions of the foreign. Investigating such entanglements reveals specific modes of appropriation and knowledge formation. So the social negotiation of identities and distinctions often runs through food and drink. We know that. According to Eva Barlösius, cuisines, in the sense of a complex set of rules governing the way of producing and preparing food, transmit experiences of identity and foreignness. At the same time, recipes, as the main form of transmission of past cuisines, also provide information about perceptible and perceived concepts of space. In the recipes, space is defined and illustrated by both the sender and the recipient on the basis of the ingredients and their real and imagined origins, for example, by indicating the origin of dishes or individual ingredients. So in the next 15 minutes, I will discuss whether and how geographical spaces are represented in German language recipes up to the 16th century, and which conclusions these words and phrases permit about the spheres of identity and authority, or the own and the foreign. Comparing this implicit and explicit semantics offers clues to possible temporal and spatial continuities and changes. So my questions are the dishes associated with specific regions or countries? From which areas do certain ingredients come, and is this noticed consciously? Do geographic localizations and markers of foreignness become more frequent over time? Do they tend to be more general, or do they refer to small regions, for example, pagan rice versus Turkish rice? So also of interest for me are geographically marked ingredients that are either recognizable by a foreign language or presumably Germanized name, or are clearly labeled as Welsh, Indian, or Hungarian, for example. And then also how wide, I would ask, how wide or small is the space that is created on the basis of ingredients and designations? And something I would investigate in the future, aside from the exotic extreme periphery, for example, the spices from Southeast Asia, is there also an immediate rural environment which is also relevant? So here I'm thinking of the increasing use of root vegetables, meat or herbs, dairy products, or berries that is reported in the literature. And finally, it is much more difficult to grasp the peculiar in medieval and early modern recipes, because recipes clearly designed as traditional or typical do not seem to exist. Moreover, the perception of the closer or wider origin of dishes and ingredients seems to have only gradually gained importance and found its way into the written recipes. The investigation of this sub-aspect is part of a broader, already mentioned dissertation project on the comparative evaluation of German language cookery recipes from the Middle Ages and the early modern period as a cultural historical source. So in this context, I'm going to compare the geographic origins of individual recipes in order to identify possible regional or temporal preferences for certain ingredients or dishes. An outstanding and probably also unique example in its abundance is Max Rumpold's Ein Neues Kochbuch, which contains numerous recipes assigned to specific regions, cities, countries, or ethnic groups. In contrast, this occurs much more rarely in older recipe collections. So we know the generic attributes such as foreign, pagan, Welsh, and possible also strange, which act somehow as a marker for the exotic and unusual. The recipes recorded by the CoReMA project, together with later cookbooks, are the basis for a diachronic and synchronic comparison of the mentions I just outlined. In the following, I will only focus on Rumpold's cookbook, as it is by far the most abundant source for these questions. It stands out from earlier, but also contemporary German language recipe texts because of its numerous and very diverse ethno and toponyms. And Ein Neues Kochbuch, therefore, is the perfect test and demonstration object for this topic. In 1581, Max Rumpold, the personal chef of the Elector of Mainz, Archbishop Daniel Brendel von Homburg, was the first professional cook to share his art officially to an interested public and no longer only to his trainees. The many requests for this decision, which Rumpold mentions in his preface, are not necessarily only a literary topos in the sense of a recusatio. Manfred Lemmer takes it for realistic that the noble lords try to preserve the knowledge of their experienced and, in Rumpold's case, especially internationally versed cooks for the future. In the preface, Rumpold ranks his work very high among the knowledge literature of the liberal arts. Without the knowledge of the healthy preparation of food, all people of high or low status would live but fade away like a lamp without adding oil. In his eyes, the well-being and vitality of the lords are in the hand of the cooks. Therefore, according to Rumpold, they need a long and good education, also on the basis of cookbooks like his. Interestingly, however, dietary information plays a rather marginal role in his recipes, especially in contrast to the ethnonyms. In fact, he was asked to write down his knowledge rather because of his long experience on various faraway courts. Whether as a guest or a cook, he does not explicitly say. As important countries that influenced and inspired him, he mentions Italy, Russia, the Netherlands, Prussia, Poland, Hungary, Bohemia, Germany, and Austria. Rumpold was Hungarian and from the Wallachian region. Because of the Turks, he had to leave early to find a job in a foreign country. And his last station was finally Mainz. And a year before the death of his employer, he published his well-known cookbook. The high number of toponyms and ethnonyms in Rumpold is remarkable. I do not know of any other cookbook that has a comparable high frequency. In the case of Max Rumpold, for example, the sheer mass of mentions even permits conclusions on his personal focal points of knowledge, which also match his biography. On the other hand, the similarities of the recipes labeled as Hungarian, for example, show what the author, likely not without reason, understands by a Hungarian national cuisine, and that certainly influenced the ideas in the German-speaking areas of the early modern period as well. Günther Wiegelmann counts 48 Hungarian, 16 Spanish, 4 Polish and 4 Bohemian, 3 Italian, 2 Turkish and 1 English dish in the cookbook. That Rumpold alludes more twice as often to the culinary traditions of Hungary that to any other in total is certainly related to his provenance. If this is motivated by nostalgia or by the real knowledge of a local must remain an open question, since he says that he had to leave his home country very early. Allusions to Spanish and Eastern European cuisine also seem typical of Rumpold's time in general. In the 17th century, English, French, and Dutch cuisine became more prominent, which is evident from later cookbooks. Wiegelmann, who did the same count for Maria Sophia Schellhammer's book, Die wohlunterwiesene Köchin of 1697, found 15 English, 10 French, 6 Dutch, Spanish, and Polish dishes, 3 Italian, 2 Hungarian, and 1 Russian dish. So the focus of perception is clearly shifted, and probably also the importance attributed to the dishes of these European regions. To what extent these trends might also be traced back to the past, I will explore in the next months. Even if, as Andrea Wurm writes, conclusions about the character of national cuisines are inadmissible on the basis of these mentions, I consider a comparative investigation on the level of discourses to be promising. Before the recipe section, Rumpold presents several meat and meatless menus for the imperial or peasant table. They differ much in the number of courses, less on the basis of individual dishes. Therefore, the frequency of certain foreign dishes in this case cannot be considered class-specific either. Also, the first imperial menu on a meat day contains the most dishes marked with ethnonyms, as well as by far the most mentions of ingredients marked with a place name, and also the most foreign language and thus Germanized proper names for dishes. The opposite occurs in the other imperial menus. So all menus from the imperial to the noble table contain dishes with ethnonyms, foreign products, and foreign dishes in a decreasing tendency with a simultaneous decrease in the number of dishes. Only the peasant and bourgeois menu menu contain no marked dishes or ingredients at all. Foreign ingredients here mean only clearly labeled products such as Welsh nuts, Indian hens, Parmesan cheese, Hungarian plums, Welsh fruits, or sturgeon from the Danube, but not imported products such as lemons, bitter oranges, almonds, capers, olives, or spices from the Far East. Among the recipes, we find ethnonyms mainly for meat dishes, most of them referring to Eastern Europe. Wiegelmann attributes this to the extensive imports of cattle from Eastern Europe in the 16th century. At the same time, the side dishes seem to be very distinctive as they contain a high frequency of different ethnonyms and ingredients from Europe. Exemplarily, I can now only talk about the Hungarian dishes. Almost all parts of fish, poultry, and large livestock can be prepared in the Hungarian way or properly for Hungarian gentlemen. No Hungarian recipes are found among the meatless dishes. Pickling in vinegar, smoking, and roasting on a pit are characteristic for them. Several times, Rumpold recommends the addition of garlic. Willst du es aber einem ungarischen Herrn kochen, so musst du Knoblauch darunter nehmen. And he notes that Hungarians, like Poles, consume garlic a lot and with pleasure. Meat and fish in Hungarian style can be prepared either black or yellow. In most of the cases, Hungarian style is equivalent to a black pepper sauce. In Hungarian, yellow style can be prepared in some cases fish or poultry. These dishes are always marked as sweet. The black pepper sauce gets its color from Schweiß, that's blood, then also fried onions, rye bread, broth, as well as pepper, cinnamon, and cloves. Furthermore, it always contains apple and a little vinegar, and occasionally parsley, small black raisins, and saffron. Auf Ungarisch gelb eingemacht, meat or fish dishes contain apple, onions, lemons, broth, and some wine vinegar, and are seasoned with pepper, saffron, sugar, or even ginger. Also here, optionally, some parsley can be sprinkled on top. Rumpold does not explicitly explain the high number of international dishes and their specific localization. He only mentions his Hungarian roots and his many professional stations in the preface. With this book, he aims to pass on his extensive knowledge and skills to the next generation. Also in the preface, he names diligence, cleanliness, and speed as the most important virtues of a chef who, due to his influence, bears great responsibility for the health and well-being of his employers. The most important thing for him as a service provider is to meet the wishes of the master in every situation. So international experience seems to be important for a chef and to distinguish his employers. There was apparently a desire to enjoy international dishes and thus the touch of foreignness in familiar surroundings. And an internationally savvy chef is also able to meet and appreciate the international guests of his employer and their needs, demonstrating again in the name of the employer a sign of hospitality and cosmopolitanism. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Great presentation. Are there any questions in the Q&A?
No, there are not yet in the Q&A, but Helmut has a question again.
Yes, thank you. Barbara, I was wondering if you want to suggest an explanation for the difference between the noble and the bourgeois meal tables. with in the one having all the references to foreign countries, and the other and in the other this reference is missing?
Until now, I don't have an explanation for that, but I don't think that the amount of foreign dishes or ingredients is class specific, not at all class specific, because as I mentioned, the first imperial menu has a lot of mentions of foreign dishes and ingredients, but the second imperial menu has not. So I don't know if we can consider that class specific. From the traditional point of view, we always think that foreign dishes are a sign of high class cuisine. Maybe yes, maybe not. I have to investigate further in that question.
Okay, thank you. So basically, the more foreign, the more fancy the dish is.
Yeah.
Okay. I've got another question, but yeah, well, let's see. You've been talking about the difference in coloring of the Polish and Hungarian dishes. Do you have an idea if this coloring has maybe a semantic, a cultural, or a dietetic function, or why are the colors attributed to these people?
I mentioned that we have two Hungarian style sauces. We have the yellow one and the black one, and you can prepare nearly every meat or fish in black style, but only poultry and fish. So basically white meat or white stuff in yellow. Maybe it has a dietetic reason in behind, but he does not mention it.
Okay, so basically I heard it wrong from the beginning. Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the questions. Barbara, I think we have to move on, and other questions can be raised in the final minutes. Thank you. If there's nothing more from Julia, but I think not. Okay.
No, there is no question in the Q&A, but people can just write them in there, and Barbara can either answer them, type the answer in the chat, or we can come back to them in a conclusion.
Yeah, I know what's happening. People are typing, and they just send it in the final minute. We shall see. Let me introduce to you Marlene Ernst of the University of Salzburg also. As with Barbara Denicoló, we have a student of the digital humanities here. Marlene Ernst even studied applied computer sciences and is therefore able to program her own databases. She finished her PhD in 2019 concerning recipes for the digital age, computer-aided processing of cultural historical source corpora shown on the basis of cookbook literature of the early modern period. So we're moving on in time. And she's a good collaborator at Gastrosophie for many years. Marlene, your presentation, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction and also for the organizers for this great symposium. Let me share my presentation now. I hope you can see the slides. Well, the question that plagues us all is, where do certain aspects of life come from? Our eating habits are no exception to that, and food traditions are nowadays also a marker for cultural identification. For the early modern period, we have different focus points concerning designations of origins than since the times of growing nationalism of the 19th century. And what those are shall be looked at in the following presentation of mine. And it's great that Barbara showed us the focus on Rumpold, because he will be part here as well, but only in a smaller context. Basis, well, so basis for today's findings in my presentation is the recipe database at the Gastrosophy at the History Department of the University of Salzburg. Because of the time constraints, I will give only a short overview of the content. You can read here with me what the database all contains on source material. Should you have any detailed questions on single sources, please ask me in the asking session afterwards, or write to me. I'm always happy to clarify anything. The link also can be found right on the top. And the open access database is a tool to help with detailed analysis and comparisons of single recipes, and also whole sources, and comprises manuscripts as well as printed cookbooks from the late 15th century up to the 18th century. And as you can see, there are not only German source materials included, but also Varennes French Cook in its French original first edition. It's a work in progress at the moment. And for example, also an English cookbook, Mrs. Eel's Complete Confectioner, is included predominantly because I wanted to try different comparison methods without language constraints. As I mentioned, some of the sources are still a work in progress and inserted into the database. Others have all the recipes already included, like, for example, Konrad Hacker's Neues Salzburgisches Kochbuch from 1718-19 with over 2,500 recipes. They are all tagged with additional information like dietetic usages when mentioned, and as we use for today, the designations of origins. Overall, we can find almost 10,000 recipes in the database as of yet. And within those, over 2,000 ingredients are used, and 79 different preparation categories could be identified. Material culture is also captured within the database and can be used for analysis, as well as I mentioned, the applications of dietetics. But for today, the 125 designations of origin will be the prominent part of everything. And from the 10,000 recipes in the database, over 500 of them mention geographic locations or names which can be attributed to designations of origin. Those designations of origin vary significantly on the author and also on the intended recipients. Taking a look at early modern recipe and manuscripts and printed cookbooks, it is important to note that they have various focal points relating to those. And firstly, there are the title descriptions in the the geographic name dropping in the titles, so to say, and those also have different focal points. For example, the first mentioned here, the sardines refer to a special quality of food in their main ingredients, or illustrate how to prepare or deal with an ingredient of a certain quality. We also see similar things with the Styrian ham, for example, which is a recipe which can be found in different sources. And it's praised for its special taste. The early modern German manuscripts very often refer to Italian dishes by using Welsh, like in the second example here. And here it is used to describe a small dish of capon or partridge, and the word pegetel could not be clearly clarified, but probably it means bagatelle. That means from the context, it would be an Italian gratinated trifle. The preparation is similar to the one of a lasagne, but without the noodles and bread instead of them. The third example presented here is also mentioned in my title for today. And the Polish soups or sauces can be found in various sources. We have heard from Hungarian and Polish soups and sauces also in the presentation beforehand of Barbara. And a contemporary encyclopedia tells us that another kind of court bouillon that's called Polish broth, where the fish is cooked in wine with bay leaves, rosemary, salt and pepper and other spices. But taking a closer look on the recipes itself, which have the designation Polish in them, there seems to be another common denominator for the designation. And it lies in the usage of sweet sour components like wine, onions, raisins, and almonds in a piquant dish. Those designations of origin can not only be found in the titles themselves, but also in the ingredients. Like, for example, lemons from Genoa or Austrian wine, as mentioned in the example. Austrian wine meant back then the inferior one. So how you see it today, you can decide for yourself, but they gave some of the specifications given with the ingredients can give us a clue to the quality of a product. We have seen the sardines have a special good quality, but Austrian wine, on the other hand, can mean it's the not so good one. Overall, there are over 500 mentions of designations of origin in the database focus on Europe. You have here a map of Europe today with the color signifying the number of mentions in the database. Location information outside of Europe can also be found for China, Jordan, America, and India, as well as Jamaica. Most of the time, the context of special imported goods are the focus point with them. So we have almonds from Jordan or China oranges. But in comparison to the European geographic information presented in the early modern recipes, they are relatively small in number. The focus is clearly on the importing countries of exotic ingredients and the sources of supply for these, like Italy and Spain. The countries considered to be culinary pioneers, again Italy, but also France is mentioned in this context, and the German-speaking regions or countries of origin of the cookbooks. So we have also local regional focus points in certain sources. The sources entered in the database, they, as I mentioned, differ in the number of location-related references per cookbook, but there are definite differences in the focus of the sources. We've already heard of Rumpold today, but and mention him here as well. You can see here Hungary, Spain, Turkey. Turkey especially is mentioned so often because of a special chapter in his cookbook mentioning the Turkish sheep, which is its very fat tail is the main characteristic of this sheep. And yeah, as we have heard many things of Rumpold so far, so I don't have to repeat it all, but with him we see the personal the personal how he personally evolved, and which ways he took to land in Mainz, where he wrote his cookbook. Another source I have here for comparison is the so-called Nuremberg cookbook from 1691. It's, I chose it because it's addressed specifically for bourgeoisie public, and we can see this also in the designations of origin, as many mentions are of the German locations. So we have, for example, the Nuremberg gingerbread, which is used in many dishes. And here also Konrad Hacker, who is also, his work is huge success, last but not least, because of the many copperplate illustrations which are included and show us how to make the decorations. And it's interesting to see that with him we have the Italy-Spain context, as well as England as a third in the importance of designations of origin. He this uses lemons from Genoa, and we can see his location. He was also in Switzerland before he went to Salzburg, and the trading routes through Salzburg can be seen, as he mentions also next to the lemons from Genoa, ones from the Lake Garda. And so we have the personal biographies which shape the cookbooks and the dishes. The characteristics based on the countries and sources are varying and depending on the source itself, as I mentioned. But one reason for the naming of local indications is to raise awareness of the diversity that was brought to the table. It was less about demonstrating regionality or terroir. Such trends did not emerge until the rise of nationalism in the early 19th century. But what we can see is that the personal experiences and career stages are made visible, and the representations and food as status symbol, the quality of dishes and ingredients, which is stated through those designations of origins, is another point. I already mentioned with the Nuremberg cookbook that the local and regional designations seem predominantly a characteristic for the cookbooks for the bourgeoisie, but others show more international trends. And last but not least, the trading routes and the goods which are identified with certain regions, they are also part of the characteristics of the designations of origin. But not only are they interesting to analyze sources by themselves.
Marlene, considering time, because we still want to discuss, could you maybe jump to your conclusion?
Yes, of course. It's the almost last slide, so I will be quick about it, and thank you for the reminder. So we have sources which are also can be seen through different source material, and they are not the same within, but they have certain commonalities, like the Polish soup mentioned before, but they also can change and not mean the same in terms of content, but they are named the same, as we can see, for example, with the Linzer Torte. Last but not least, let me mention personal annotations. They are mainly found in the manuscripts, and they are also as a means to signify quality. Like in Lady Fanshaw's recipe book, it's almost every recipe has in the margin or in the title some mentioning of a doctor or another aristocratic lady from whom she got the recipe. And those can also be found in German source material, and sometimes whole chapters are designated to a certain lady from where the recipes are taken. And those designations are immensely important in order to find out the transfer of recipes and culinary knowledge. And I will stop here and hope you could take some information from this quick overview over 10,000 recipes of the early modern period. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlene. And I can see there's already a question in the Q&A.
Yes, we do already have a question by Elke Grotz. How does the database handle persons as sources, so Zuträgerinnen? If they are foreigners, is their home country treated as the origin of the recipe? For example, a Spanish queen at an Austrian court as Königin Maria of Spain. Would you classify her recipe as Spanish or as Austrian?
I would depend it on the biography of the person mentioned. It's with the names, it's oftentimes very difficult to identify which aristocratic lady is meant because of the different ways to spell their names. But if there should be no one country to be identifiable, I would place the person in both. That's a feature of the database. It's very flexible and dynamic in this way. So if we find out, oh, the lady Zinzendorf is not the Zinzendorf from Upper Austria or wherever she's from, but somewhere wholly different, 2 or 3 clicks and it's it's in the right slot. So and for example, we have this with the Bodensee region. It's if a certain fish is mentioned from the Bodensee, it's not clear which part of the Bodensee, which country should we put it from our perspective. So I have the tag Bodensee, and it refers to
the area,
more than one country.
Okay,
thanks.
Another question from Helmut Kluh.
Yes, thank you. Hello. Thanks for the impressive presentation. I have a question that goes in a similar direction. I was wondering how you come to your geographic labels. Do you only use verbal mentions of countries or regions, or do you also interpret recipes so that you say, okay, this is a recipe that has to be from Italy?
Only direct mentioning of certain designations of origin are included in the database tagging. So should there be any interpretation, it's part of the comment section, but not for the designation. It should be as clear as possible in the sense of what the author meant, the intention of the author with those designations was a point in favor for this approach.
Okay, thank you. Sounds like a good decision. Thanks.
Yes, and that's definitely a question we should keep in mind. I don't know if we have time to discuss it today, but are there any specific regional or country-specific dishes at all? You know, it popped up many times. Can we make out criteria to say this is Polish or Italian or whatever? Okay, but we don't have time to discuss it now. Thank you, Marlene. And we move on to Robert Moretti. Last but no means least, as you say, he's also a colleague from the University of Salzburg, a colleague from the early modern epoch and European history. His PhD project focuses on the appropriation of coffee in the region of Graz, Austria, in the long 18th century. And his CV he handed in also says he holds a special interest in intoxicants. We can ask him later what that means. Now, Robert, please start your presentation.
Yeah, Michael, thank you very much for your brief introduction to my person. And thank you for the panelists and the concept designers of this conference for inviting me to hold the talk. The global transfer and diffusion of plants is most commonly associated with the so-called Columbian exchange following the transoceanic voyages of the 15th and 16th centuries. Europe, at least, started importing increasing numbers of previously unknown plants and consumer goods during the 16th and 17th centuries. These exchange processes were certainly entangled, as Barbara mentioned before, in complex webs of knowledge, technology, and practices, which is maybe the driving point of our panel. With this short thoughts on my topic, dear ladies and gentlemen in the audience, I want to welcome you to my lecture about the Ottomans in Styria, or how the Türkensterz conquered early modern Styrian cuisine. I got some brief information before I start my lecture. First of all, with my lecture, I want to maybe broaden the scope of our panel a little bit, because I'm not talking about a single recipe or anything. I'm talking about an ingredient. And the ingredient I will be talking in the next 15 minutes is maize. And the second thing I want to say before I start, actually, I also want to broaden the scope of the timetable of our panel and maybe the conference, because the conference is from the 12th to the 17th century. And maybe take a look maybe 100 or 200 years later on. Based on these introductory considerations, my lecture is divided into 3 parts. The first part is the relationship of maize to the native plants in order to put the changes in eating habits into an appropriate context. Subsequently, and in accordance with the thematic orientation of our panel, the terminology behind the terms maize, Turkish wheat, Turks, and cucuruts, i.e. those terms commonly used for maize in Styria, will be questioned in the second part. Until well into the 19th century, despite Linné's classification that had already taken place, the terms Turks and cucuruts remained the predominant term for maize in large parts of Styria. The third part, and actually main part of this lecture, is finally the maize or the Turk in the Styrian culinary recipes. The best known representative for this lecture is the so-called Sterz. And so I'm very glad to have some other Styrian colleagues here. Maybe they can help me later on to translate the term Sterz into an English pronoun. This national dish of the Styrians, the Sterz, was subject to many changes with the emergence of maize in Styria, as were the eating habits themselves, as we will see later on, which directly leads me to the first chapter of my lecture, from the New World to the Old World and to Styria. I know this picture you see beside me, or maybe at the back of me, is a little bit anachronistic because it shows Pocahontas, which is about 300 years later. But it exemplifies the direction I want to go in this chapter, to show you how it came that maize, imported at about 1495, became a homegrown vegetable, as seen on the right side with the advertisement of Sei amalt music, an advertisement of the Styrian government shown in 2019. Maize, as I said, was first imported in 1495 and was distributed relatively quickly in Europe. It was already traceable in the second half of the 16th century in the studied area of Styria in a village called Heathen. In an interrogation protocol from 1572, 2 accused women mentioned Turkish wheat or Turks in their gardens. Interestingly, the Turkish wheat was known to the peasant woman, but wasn't to the lordmanship administrator. Only a few years later, at the beginning of the 17th century, maize is mentioned in different millers' orders throughout Styria. The position at the end of these lists illustrates its present insignificance. Mentions in different proper inventories in the following century, spread all over the country of Styria, give the impression of a wide distribution of maize. Even so, large-scale studies from this period are still lacking. Crucial for this appropriation process in the European late Middle Ages and the early modern period were the prevailing agricultural crisis, crop failures, epidemics, and armed conflicts, which posed new challenges to the food supply. It was only then that maize, due to its comparatively high yield on a constant area, became the focus of attention for the lordly authorities and subsequently the farming population. Thus, a rebut to the Styrian administration in 1670 states, I quote in English, "The peasants must do with Turkish wheat, buckwheat, and millet all year round, because they need the heavy grain to pay the taxes," quote end. Following a calculation of Paul Ofner, about 35% of the stock in granaries by the end of the 18th century was maize by then. The Turkish wheat thus became a crucial component of people's diets, even so, as we will see, only in the peasant milieu, since it's found only sparse acceptance among the urban population until well into the 20th century. Starting in the late 16th century, maize initiated a process of displacement of native plant species that can be considered about 1.5 centuries later, which directly leads me to the second part of my presentation, the terms maize, Turkish wheat, Turks, or Kovacs in Styria. As early as 1534, Leonhard Fuchs referred to maize as Turkish wheat in his New Kräuterbuch, citing its local origin, an interpretation that shaped the perception of the plant or the dishes prepared from it accordingly. In contrast, the name Welsh corn is used for the same plant in Upper Styria or the Alpine foothills. In Lower Styria, on the other hand, maize is known as turska. In the neighboring Carinthia, the Italian loanword surk or sorgo d'orco was in use well until the 20th century. This allows to establish a brief connection between the direction of distribution and the naming. The term Kukuruc, borrowed from Serbo-Croatian, is mainly found in southeastern Styrian border region. A derivation from the Ottoman word kokoroc, which is a takeover into the Russian, or a derivation from Romanian, seems to be controversial due to the etymology. Then, as well, there is another theory that tries to look behind the term Kukuruc or Turks, where it's the appearance which makes the designation as Turkish seem possible, as you can see on the picture next to me. As I can't see it, I'm only referring to literature. Finally, the term Turk, which is common in Styria, may have suggested to the novelty of maize in Europe in early years as an early bird of the so-called Türkenmania, which starts about 100 years later, maybe. This also may be an attempt to classify it into known schemes and establish itself as a common over the course of time, which actually leads to the third part of my lecture. The Turkish wheat, or the Turks, which is also the name of my lecture in Culinary Recipes in Styria. The choice of consumed food heavily depends on the environmental as well as socio-cultural context and differs through different classes. A well-known representative of Styrian cuisine is the so-called Sterz, or in later Türkensterz or Türkischsterz. The national food Sterz of the Styrians was subject to changes with the emerge of maize, as were the eating habits themselves. As there is no adequate translation, as I mentioned before, for the word sterz, the only explanation of this dish seems to be the shown picture of a modern Türkensterz. At this point, it is important to distinguish between the recipes of the peasantry, which were handed down orally for a long time, and those of the urban population, which were fixed in cookery books. Let us start with the rural recipes. Maize grits began to replace buckwheat in peasant cooking relatively quickly. To prepare the Türkensterz, the naming dish of my lecture, maize grits is placed in a greased pan with milk or water, then fried, and once cooked, torn with a fork and crumbled. Another form of a peasant sterz recipe is the so-called Brodelsterz. It's just a dialectic word for simmering, which is a reference of the way of preparation. Whereas sterz is originally fried, Brodelsterz, on the other hand, is baked on the oven. A mixture of these preparation techniques is the Turkish Brodelsterz. For this recipe, a large pot of lightly salted water is boiled, and then the entire maize meal is poured into so that a sticky lump of flour arises. As soon as this lump rises in the boiling water, a hole is pierced into the middle so that the water can boil out through the hole. It looks like maybe a modern donut at this time. Once the resulting dumpling is cooked, the lump is torn again with fork and put aside to steam. The previously used cooking water is now put back into the torn dumpling until it has swelled again. Repeatedly, the dumpling is torn with the fork and then fried in hot fat. The so-created Kochsterze, or cooked sterzes, began to become the daily breakfast at the beginning of the 17th century. The mixture, the Türkensterz or Turks cooked sterz, is often additionally poured over with milk or soup. And later in the 18th century, coffee was added as an alternative to that. So the dishes like milksterz, coffee sterz, or soup sterz became valid breakfast alternatives. Even so, the cheaper Türkenkochsterz, Turkish cooked sterz, remained as a breakfast in poorer houses. A rural manor house can now serve as an example for such sterz breakfast. To feed 20 servants, one needs 2 1/3 pints of maize meal and 9 pints of green steamed milk daily. Converted into today's measurements, one needs approximately 2.6 kilograms of maize flours and 12.5 liters of skimmed milk to feed 20 persons. In terms of one person, about 120 grams of maize flour and 0.6 liters of skimmed milk were required for breakfast daily. There is no mention of the now obligatory clarified butter over the sterz breakfast. In peasant households, where the servants sat at the table with the peasant family, however, the sterz may have already been larded. Apart from the sterz breakfast, the so-called Turkish soup became popular, especially among the peasant population of the western and northern Styria. For this soup, the maize semolina is boiled in salt water. It needs to smell as much as possible, resulting in a soft porridge. Then it is removed from the fire, mixed with plenty of cold, sweet, or sour milk. This mixing of boiling porridge and cold liquid turns into a soupy, mouth-warming dish which needs to be eaten immediately. This soup, prepared this way I showed, was eaten and is still eaten up to three times a day in northern and western Styria. In contrast, even at the beginning of the 19th century, the urban population of Graz found dishes made from maize as inadvisable. Maize bread, for example, was considered too heavy and too hard to digest. The first reference of Turks in urban milieu cookery books occurs in the Duchess Maria Eleonora Rosalia von Troppa-Jägersdorfs freiwillig aufgesprungener Granatapfel, ein ganz neues und nutzbares Kochbuch, first published in 1696. This recipe, however, isn't connected with maize itself. For the production of so-called Turkish papier, Turk's paper, one needs mainly sugar and lemon juice, but no maize. So the name of the dish isn't referred to maize itself. Jakob Melin takes a similar view in his grätzerisch durch Erfahrung geprüftes Kochbuch, first published in 1792. In his recipe for pickled meat preserved in sugar, he recommends replacing the sugar with a surrogate made from boiled down juice of Turkish widespread stalks. Again, this recipe doesn't use maize, but the stalks of the plant are, again, as before, maybe associated with a surrogate of sugar. It actually took well until the middle of the 19th century for maize to find its way into the cooking recipes of the citizens of Graz. Maize, Turks, and cucuruts are mentioned for the first time in several recipes of the now famous cookbook by Katharina von Prato, Die Süddeutsche Küche, for beginners and practical cooks compiled. The so-called Dommal, we got to know it already before as Brodelsterz in the peasant milieu, and Sterz, originally native to the rural cuisine, are written down for the first time into recipes. The famous, and now from a lecture naming recipe for Türkensterz reads: put 7 deciliters of flour into 1.5 liters of boiling water, cook it like the Heidensterz, which is made of buckwheat, but for a shorter time, pour some hot water or lard over it and add some milk. The big difference between the Sterz and the Dommal, as mentioned before, is the way of preparation. While the former is and was prepared on an open fire, the Dommel is, like the Brodelsterz or Simmeringssterz, an oven dish, as the instruction reads. Put 2 pints of sweet, sour or stirred milk, barbered with 1 pint of Turkish flour and salt. It is also good to add lard with tarnished onion, pour it only finger thick into a heavily greased frying pan and bake it in the tube till crispy and brown. This only happens when it has enough fat and heat. Additionally, Katharina von Prato gives us some little tricks to turn this Türkendommel, as seen on the picture besides, into a plum or apple dommel. The simple trick she mentions is add, instead of onions, some plums or apples. Curious again appears actually the preparation recommendation for a Kukuruz tea or a maize tea, which is prepared as follows. For the nourishing, easy digestible tea of Turkish wheat, soak the crushed grains for a few hours and then boil them until the water has become somewhat slimy and smells like vanilla. It is drunk with sugar and milk instead of coffee, or with sugar and a little rum for hot red wine. And for all my colleagues holding a presentation like I do or will hold a presentation in the next few days, she has some tips for a sour throat. Prepared with milk, sugar and yolk, like light cream. It is drunk after reading aloud to help the sore throat. These are only selected examples where the Turk as ingredient shaped the cooking recipes in the city of Graz. There would be a lot of other examples where different stereotypes are connected to a dish. For everyone buying corn in cans, there is another tip Katharina von Prato can give you in her cooking book. Because she says you can just pickle corn as you do it with other. You can pickle Turkish wheat in vinegar like you can do it with other foodstuff, which does make the canned corn obsolete and it saves you some money. To sum up my short lecture about maize in Styrian cooking recipes, there are 3 things that need to be considered. First, maize spread relatively soon after the discovery of the Americas in Europe and in Styria, so that it has become a serious food alternative already in the 16th and then especially in the 17th century. From 1492 to 1572 to the first mentions of maize in Styria to 1750s, it was only about 250 years. Second, the designation Turkish wheat, Turks, maize, or Kukuruz depend both regionally and on situation. While Kukuruz predominates in southeastern Styria, Türken and Turks is still common throughout whole Styria. It is also found quite commonly in the naming of dishes in a relatively timely manner. Also, the actual derivation cannot be clarified. And third, and the actually main part of my lecture, maize is a typical example of a bottom-up product of the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. It relatively quickly replaced ancestral ingredients in cooking recipes and modified dishes among the peasant population due to its relatively large yield on a constant area. It took until well into the beginning of the 19th century before maize actually arrived in urban kitchens, where it was known in rural populations about at least 150 years ago. And finally, I would like to share a small advice for all colleagues who are planning a cooking demonstration during the course of this conference, like my colleague Brauer will have one on Friday, which I can recommend you to watch. The best way to clean copper and press pans is with a paste made from Turkish flour. Mix the Turkish flour with vinegar, rinse the pan with it, and then dry it with sawdust. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert, also for the practical applications. I will try to appreciate that, and the others hopefully as well. There's time for 1 or 2 final questions, and I see Barbara Denicoló has raised her hand already. Barbara.
Yeah, Thank you very much. And I'm very glad about the polenta presentation, since I like also polenta as much as stockfish. I want to ask, in Italy we know only the simmering polenta. So what's again the difference to Sterz? How do you prepare the Sterz? As I didn't got it.
It's obviously it's quite the same dish and preparation style. You just put the maize meal into a pan, put some water, milk, same as milk on the top. You just preheat it in the pan, and afterwards you just crumble it with a fork. So it's maybe, if you can say it, and okay. I hope I don't say something wrong to my Styrian colleagues. It's just a polenta you crumble with the fork and fry it in the pan, mainly.
Okay, yeah.
Whereas polenta has the
so and Barbara also had the more common translation at hand. Polenta is probably what.
Yeah, but that's the Italian thing.
Yeah, but polenta and Sterz is not quite the same, because.
No.
No, but I mean it's not the same, but it's a more common expression for that. But let's see, Helmut Klug is also having a question.
Yeah, well, coming from Styria, I thought I should intervene at this point of the discussion. I would have suggested polenta as a translation for Sterz too, but of course, you're right, it isn't the same. While the polenta is more in the form of a puree, and more saucy, the polenta, the Sterz as a dish is rather dry. So that's basically the difference I would see there. But nonetheless, in English I would call it polenta, because it's probably a little bit more comprehensible than the Sterz as a vocabulary.
Yeah, I'm quite common with that, but yeah, as you really mentioned it yourself, it's a slight difference between polenta and Sterz, and I don't want it to confuse more than I did already.
And I think everybody outside Austria is probably fascinated by this. No, it's not. I'm not kidding. It's a really rich culture of traditional foods, which are made of very, very simple ingredients. And however, it's if you prepare it the right way and just put little things in it, it's a whole different world. So maybe if there's no other questions, then
one question I would have.
One final remark.
Yeah, do you have evidence for Sterz or polenta with jam or marmalade? So as Sterz with coffee, for example?
There are some slight examples where the Sterz is where it's prepared in a sweet way, and there sometimes is mentioned marmalade or jam, but it's not that common in southeastern Styria and the region of Graz, I would say, as I can't remember a quite recipe for it at hoc.
Well, that maybe it's something we have to taste in an experimental fashion. Maybe tomorrow in the morning, you can try it, Barbara. You can try it with jam and tell us about it. Okay, so I'm summarizing in 3 points. First, in the move from the Middle Ages to the early modern times, the expression pagan was first ambivalent, meaning either dangerous or exotic, and developed more into the exotic realm. And I was wondering if the term pagan, exotic, if this was replaced by the term international, some of you mentioned in your presentations. And it would be interesting to check when and in which recipe collection there's the last mention of the term pagan. Second, the personal background is decisive. The personal background and the geographical proximity. And I think there we have a link between the pagan, so-called pagan recipes and the regional recipes. Because we have, on the one hand, the European Arab contact zones in the south of Europe, but we have also people like Max Rumpold, who has who has a Hungarian background and therefore a strong connection. Third, and I tried to make a question out of it. Are there at all identifiable regional or national dishes at all? And we have heard some hints. I think a further analysis of ingredients would further enlighten that point. And the last point is an outlook and another question for all of you to go to bed with. Is there a connection of regional, national dishes to the cosmos of stereotypes of European people? We have these stereotypes, for instance, how the Frenchman, how the Englishman, or how the German behaves and what he does not. We have these stereotypes since the Middle Ages, and it would be interesting to find out if there are connections to the so-called national dishes. Okay, I always find it good to end with questions because scholarship never ends. I think the organizers and the presenters for their great presentations, the people who asked questions or just moved some ideas in their mind. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to the rest of this great conference. Goodbye.